Well, thanks very much, Stuart. I'm really grateful to the Long Now Foundation for bringing me out here. I was actually supposed to have given a lecture in November, but I had a little accident on my bike. But I'm back on my feet and really glad to be here. When Stuart first asked me to speak in this series, he said, this is a series on long-term thinking, and can you talk about anything? And I thought, most of what I do is pretty policy oriented towards the next 6 months to 2 years. And I said, well, probably not. And then it occurred to me I'd written this book a while ago called The End of History and the Last Man. And I said, well, yeah, actually, that does fit in to the overall framework of this series pretty well. And I have been thinking about this consistently ever since I wrote the original article with that title 17 years ago. So maybe we could talk about that. So that's what I'm going to speak to you about today. So what I'm going to do is first, since there's been a lot of misunderstanding about this, I'm just going to restate what the end of history was all about. And then I'm going to go through 4 different objections. Every conceivable objection to this theory has been raised by one person at some point over the years, but I want to deal with the ones that I believe are the most cogent, and quite honestly, they're ones that I don't necessarily have answers to. And for all I know, the theory could be complete bunk and will be disproven. And in fact, I'll give you several empirical tests for whether the theory is correct or whether you'll be able to see that it's correct as we go through the lecture. And the 4, just to give you a little heads up, the 4 objections first has to do with radical Islam and its rejection of modernity. Second has to do with the lack of collective action and accountability and basically democracy at an international level. The third has to do with the problem of poverty, about how you get on the modernization escalator. And then the 4th has to do with technology. Now, let me go to the question of what the end of history was about. In about 10 days, I'm going to get on an airplane. I'm going to go to Japan to give a couple of lectures. And then after about 10 days in Japan, I'm going to fly down and spend a couple of weeks in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Now, between Japan and Papua New Guinea, you basically get the 2 ends of the development spectrum, at least as it exists in today's world, from a society in the highlands where you actually have certain pockets or tribes that have not seen the next tribe over in PNG, much less a European or an Australian or a Japanese or anyone else. It was a society that was completely acephalous. There was no state, and many of the people in the highlands are still basically living at a hunter-gatherer level of existence. And then, of course, Japan is Japan. So the question is, there was a certain period in human history when virtually the whole of the world looked like Papua New Guinea. Everybody was divided up into these little groups of 50, 60 people, very isolated, without technology to produce agriculture, without higher forms of political organization. Today, increasing parts of the world look like Japan. China, the largest country in the world, is hurtling in that direction. And the question that this raises is this a coherent process, and is there a reason to think that the kind of modernization that takes you from the level of Papua New Guinea to the level of Japan is actually driven by deeper social, economic, historical forces, or is it all just a big accident? Could we all return to the status of being Highlanders at some point in the future? And is there any particular reason to think that the kinds of political systems we see around us have this kind of deeper historical meaning? Now, this is basically a theory about modernization. I guess that's the simplest way to explain it. And of course, modernization is something that virtually every intellectual believed in over the past, I would say, 150 years. And in fact, in the years prior to the 1980s, a large majority, I would say, of progressive intellectuals believed not only that there would be a progressive modernization as human societies evolved, but that there was also an end of history. And the end of history would be some form of communist utopia. And when I wrote my original article, in 1989, I made a very simple observation, which was that I, too, like all of the Marxists, believed that there was this progressive history that was propelling societies to different and more complex levels of social organization, but that it didn't look like we were ever going to get to communism. That whatever seemed to be at the terminal point of this modernization process was some version of a market-based economy and some version of liberal democracy. And so it was actually a fairly modest thesis that we would be getting off this train one stop earlier than most people had anticipated. And so it was not an outlandish thesis in terms of the way that people had thought about human history, but it did seem to reflect to me what were the big developments at that time. Now, in terms of universal histories, of which Marxism is a variant, there have been a lot of them written in history. A lot of them are Christian, because the Christian Bible actually talks about a beginning of history in the Garden of Eden, or the creation story, and it talks about an end of history when God's kingdom arrives. And in a certain sense, Marxism was a secular version. It really, in a sense, took Hegel to say that what we have in the human historical process is something like the story of the Christian Bible, except played out in increasingly secular terms, and that was a story that then Marx continued. You can actually enlarge the story because the kind of human history that I am going to talk about has not been in existence for more than about 10,000 years. Bob Wright wrote a book a few years ago called Non-Zero, in which he actually tried to place all of human history in a history of the biosphere in general, in which he noted that there was this very long-term, over the course of billions of years, an evolution as you went from prokaryotes to eukaryotes to multicellular organisms, where individual single-celled organisms learned to live with each other and cooperate in multicellular beings, and then so on up the evolutionary chain. I'm not going to get into that part of the story, but it is possible, if you take a sufficiently long perspective, as I guess we're supposed to do in this series, to see that actually human evolution and the evolution of human societies does take place in a much broader evolutionary story that includes non-humans as well. Now, the main person who has raised a systematic objection to my version of the end of history, my version of modernization. That is to say that there is a universal process of modernization that sooner or later most societies will arrive at, is actually my former teacher and still a friend, a good friend, Samuel Huntington, who wrote a book a few years after the end of history called The Clash of Civilizations. And he made a very different kind of argument. He said that the evolution of human societies in the direction of liberal democracy was a kind of accident, that culture is the ultimate way that the societies define themselves, that there will be 7 or 8 major cultural groups that will be largely invariant, and that what I see as a universal set of values, potentially universal set of values and institutions that were developed in the West are actually the cultural emanation of the particular Christian culture that happened to develop in this particular part of Northern Europe at a particular historical time. But that if you grew up in a Hindu or a Confucian or an Orthodox Christian or Muslim cultural context, there is no particular reason to think that you will develop similar sorts of political institutions. And so, in a sense, his view is that all of the developments that we have experienced in modernizing societies is really culture-bound, and that ultimately you can be modern. You can have an Islamic Republic of Iran that could presumably produce semiconductors and very high-quality cars, and yet be ruled by a system of mullahs where authority comes out of the Quran, because culture is as I said, the ultimate defining characteristic of societies that will not be overcome by the integrating forces of modernization. Now, I have a interlinked series of arguments about why, if you step back a little bit and take this long perspective, why should we think that history is directional as opposed to being simply cyclical or just random, one damn thing after another? And I would say that probably the one social phenomenon that guarantees that you're not going to have a random or a cyclical history is the accumulation of knowledge related to modern science and technology. Because if you think about social phenomena, the one thing that is cumulative and is not something subject to periodic loss, unlike, let's say, the arts or literature or even particular forms of government, is the steady accumulation of knowledge that is driven by human curiosity and human desire to be able to master and manipulate the external world. Now, I would say that at one end of this machine that I would construct, you would put the development of science and technology as the driver, and it's connected by a drive shaft to economic development, because economic development is determined by the horizon of technological possibilities made possible by any given level of technological development. So the world of coal and steel or of the steam engine produces societies that look a certain way. You start urbanizing, you start developing an industrial working class, you have highly centralized larger states. But that is very different from the kind of world that emerges after the microprocessor, after the internet, in which power tends to be more diffuse, in which it is much more difficult for centralized hierarchies to control the flow of information, the flow of power, the flow of resources. And therefore, each one of these economic ages is going to differ in systematic ways from the one that preceded it, determined by the level of technology. And I think that is fairly well accepted. The process of industrialization, as you go from resource exports to light manufacturing to heavy manufacturing to full industrialization and then to a post-industrial society, that's a pattern that's been replicated by late developers, whatever the cultural starting point from which they start off. Now, so the engine is science and technology. You have economics, and then there's a much more loose set of connecting rods that tie the economy to politics. It is the case that there is a very strong empirical correlation between high levels of economic development and liberal democracy. Now, Huntington would say that this is simply accidental, that it just so happens that the Christian West modernized first, and therefore this correlation between wealth and democracy is a byproduct of this cultural phenomenon. But it is still striking that even outside of Western, the bounds of what we call Western society, including countries in Asia, this very interesting pattern has emerged where at about $6,000 per capita income, which is about the level that Taiwan and Korea achieved sometime in the early 1980s, you get the development of an industrial working class, urbanization, much higher levels of education, universal literacy, the development of a professional class, a complex civil society, and the development of a propertied middle class, or a middle class defined in terms of its ownership of property. And all of these things have been linked in various ways to the emergence of political demands for participation in systems. There's no question that you can have authoritarian modernization at very rapid rates. This is what South Korea, Singapore, China today have all done. But at a certain level of wealth, it seems that there's a change in the nature of the society that seems to demand greater involvement and accountability in the way that governments function, which is what we call political democracy. So So the first two parts of the machine are connected fairly rigidly, but the second part is a pretty wobbly connection. There are very rich societies like Singapore that aren't democracies, and there are relatively poor societies like Costa Rica or India that are democracies. So it's not a perfect correlation. Now, at the far end of this machine, you get, I don't know, things connected by strings or something. Because when you get to the realm of culture, I actually agree with Huntington that the connections are not that great. I believe that ultimately you are not going to get a homogenization of cultures around the world. And in fact, I would hope that we do not get a homogenization of cultures. But there probably is something in the boundaries of cultural evolution that needs to take place in a really modern society. One of them may be secular politics, because among other things, it doesn't seem like it's very safe when religion enters politics in a big way, or when you get politicized religion. But I think it's probably safe to say that at the end of this train of gears, or whatever they are, that cultural homogenization, we're never going to become what Huntington calls Davos man, this global cosmopolitan, globalized, technology-using consumer, self-satisfied consumer, thank goodness. But the rest of the process, it does seem to me you can make an argument that there is this kind of set of connections. And the question is whether the institutions that we see in currently modern societies are actually, there's no question that Huntington is right, that this stuff appeared in the Christian West for reasons having to do with a particular set of cultural and historical events that took place in early modern Europe. Democracy, universal human rights is, in a way, as many philosophers, Tocqueville, Hegel, Nietzsche, have all said, it is a form of secularized Christianity. Our doctrine, contemporary doctrine of human rights, comes ultimately from the Christian doctrine of the universal equality of human beings under God based on their possession of certain divine attributes like choice, all right? So there's no question that historically there was this connection, but the question is, once you discover these institutions, do they become functional in a way that they are usable by any other civilization, regardless of its cultural starting points? The scientific method was invented by René Descartes and others in Europe at a certain historical point, but once it's discovered, it's invariant whether you're African or Asian or Latin American. The scientific method becomes a kind of universal possession. And so the question is, are liberal democratic institutions, market institutions in the economy like that, or are they, as Huntington would argue, culturally bound? I believe that even with all of the sometimes terrible political events that have happened since I first wrote this article back in 1989, right as the Berlin Wall was coming down, that basic story about modernization is still on track. It is very fashionable, I don't know, maybe it's different here in San Francisco and Washington, it's very fashionable to be pessimistic about everything. And a lot of people, like the intelligence agencies, are paid to be pessimistic. And so you focus on terrorism in the Middle East, but we are actually today, and over the past 5 years, have been living through one of the most remarkable periods in global human history where there's not a single region of the world that has not been experiencing sustained growth. And the two largest countries in the world, China and India, are leading the pack in terms of growth rates. Now, obviously, there are downsides to this, global warming and all sorts of, perhaps unsustainable trends that we've started. But in terms of people being lifted out of poverty, you've had several 100 million in that category over the past 20 to 25 years because modernization has been very successful in many, many parts of the world. And so I think the basic storyline of human development is still very much with modernization. The question is, does that modernization then require liberal democracy or not? And here you've got these really two interesting social experiments going on, which are Russia and China. Because Russia and China are both modernizing, growing economically, but basically under authoritarian regimes. I mean, in Russia, you've got elections, but basically no horizontal accountability in the political system. And in China, you've got a fully authoritarian system that suppresses dissidents, censors the internet, does all of these other sorts of things. So I told you I would give you a way of testing whether I'm right or not. So one easy test is, all you have to do is wait 20 years, and then you can write to me. But hopefully I'll be around. 20 years, you can say, which of these systems has democratic modernization at a lower level like India or at a high level like Europe and the United States and Japan, has that proved to be politically stable and successful and economically productive, or do these authoritarian modernizers prove to have certain long-term advantages? I will make the bet on the side of the liberal democracies because I believe that modern political systems have to be accountable. You cannot have good government without feedback loops built into the political system. And as societies become more complex, as they do more things, and as governments do more things, those feedback loops, those accountability mechanisms become more and more difficult, so that if people cannot protest the fact that a chemical factory is dumping very toxic chemicals into the Amur River, as happened in Harbin a couple of years ago, you are going to have a less successful society than one in which those kinds of accountability mechanisms exist. But it's a test, and I'm no prophet, so we'll have to see how those experiments work out. Now, let me go through the four objections to the theory. In a way, the existence of China and Russia constitute in themselves a kind of objection. But let me go through the other ones. So let's begin with Islam, or not the religion Islam, but the phenomenon that we've seen, particularly since September 11th, of a very radicalized Islamist ideology. Many people have said openly, this is a refutation of the end of history. Radical Islamists, Osama bin Laden, the Al-Qaeda folks, do not want modernization in any way, shape, or form. Not only don't they want liberal democracy, they don't want a modern consumer society. And so they are very determinedly stuck in the Middle Ages. Now, I have always felt, even after September 11th, that this is actually giving these groups too much credit, because, in fact, with the one complicated exception of Iran, certainly none of the Sunni groups have succeeded in coming to power in a single country. And in those places where they have succeeded, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Iran, this is not for anybody else that is not an alienated Muslim living at the fringes of a Muslim society. These are not successful models of development that other people around the world want to emulate. And the desire to promote this kind of political Islam really does not, it's not something that's typically felt by people that are not culturally Muslim to begin with. Now, the deeper question that's been raised by a lot of scholars is whether there are permanent cultural obstacles to modernization, either in the economic or in the political form, and that somehow this one particular cultural group represents a particularly severe obstacle. My general view of that is it's extremely unlikely that this is true, that there is really, as far as I can see, no inherent reason in the religion itself, Islam, to think that in a Muslim society cannot modernize economically, and in fact you've had several fairly successful cases of that, like Turkey and Malaysia or Indonesia at a lower level of development. And I also think there's no particular reason why a Muslim society cannot create and sustain a liberal democracy. And again, you've got a number of examples. Again, Turkey, Mali, Senegal, Indonesia since 1997. So the question is really, what is the radical rejection of modernity being driven by? And here I would say it comes less out of the religion Islam per se, because Islam as a religion It's very legalistic. It's very rooted in local traditions and customs that define and ascribe to individuals their particular identities. But what's very interesting about the people in the contemporary world that tend to be attracted to these Islamist or jihadist groups is that they actually are not people living in traditional Islamic societies. They are people living at the fringes of Western societies. Sometimes that's the case when they live in Western Europe in Muslim minority communities, as was the case of Mohammed Atta or Mohammed Bouyeri, who was killed, the Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh, or the July 7th subway bombers in London. Sometimes the alienation comes when the modern world comes to visit people in the Middle East in the form of internet, television, the Western cultural onslaught that we associate with globalization. And I would argue that the extremism you see is actually the result of actually what is a fairly familiar loss of identity for people that are caught in this cultural no man's land between traditional societies and successfully modernizing societies. It's quite interesting that successfully modernizing societies like India and China do not produce this kind of terrorists, but they really come more out of a stratum of people that have been exposed to modernization but have not gotten on the train successfully. And this actually, I think, makes the phenomenon something. It's not that it should make you feel good about it, but it's something we've seen before, because that was the classic sociological explanation for the social origins of both fascism and Bolshevism, that typical Bolshevik or fascist was a working class person who did not find a home in the industrialized world, just left the village, the tightly woven community, now living in a big city without a clear identity. Hitler comes along and says, I'll tell you who you are a German, and I think Osama bin Laden in many ways has been doing that. He says, I'll tell you who you are, you're a member of this global Muslim ummah, and I can define your identity very precisely in terms of the following ideology. So that doesn't mean that we are not going to have a lot of big problems dealing with this political movement now, but I just do not think that this is, rises to the level of a civilizational challenge. Second big objection to my theory has to do with the problem of international society and democracy at an international level. Now, we have these things called nation-state democracies, the United States, France, Japan, South Korea, so forth. And actually, after a couple hundred years of political development, we pretty much know, there's a lot of variance, but we pretty much know what the institutions of a modern liberal democracy ought to look like. What we really do not have in the contemporary world are mechanisms that enforce a certain degree of accountability and reciprocity at and that's another word for democracy, at an international level. And one of the things I think that's been quite striking, just traveling around the world after the Iraq War, is the degree to which this has been exacerbated by the overwhelming dominance of the United States at a whole variety of levels. The United States today spends as much on its military as the entire rest of the world combined. The British, at the height of their empire, tried to size their navy so it would be as large as the second and third largest navies, and we beat everybody combined. And that hegemony is true at a political level. We can overturn regimes 8,000 miles away. We can, in economics, the dollar continues to carry very great weight, and culturally the United States is very hegemonic. But it sets up the ground for a huge amount of anti-Americanism in the world, I think ultimately because of this lack of both what non-Americans regard as American accountability, and the lack of mechanisms of reciprocity. I don't know how many non-Americans I've heard say in the last few years, I really wish I could vote in an American election because who you elect as president has a big effect on my life, but American presidents are only accountable to American voters. And so I think there is a kind of institutional problem there. institutional problem, by the way, that I do not believe is ever going to be solved by the United Nations. I think it's going to be solved by actually a layering of multiple and overlapping international institutions, many of which will not look like traditional international organizations that I believe, simply have to populate the world as one of the consequences of globalization, because globalization does create winners and losers. And if you're going to keep the world stable at an international level, those kinds of mechanisms of accountability have to be there. So that is a task. I don't know whether it'll be accomplished, but I think it's a task that's crying out to be done. Third objection has to do with poverty and the question of how you get on this economic escalator to begin with. I mentioned earlier that the correlation between a relatively high level of economic development and liberal democracy is, as far as, I'm just a social scientist, I'm not a natural scientist, but as far as we social scientists go, it almost qualifies as a law that these two things are pretty well linked. But that presupposes that you can somehow get yourself up to the level of $6,000 per capita, and it turns out that that is actually not that easy for many societies, and there's a big chicken and egg problem here. The problem with development, I think, is really not the question of resources. It's not needing an external big push a la Jeffrey Sachs. It is a question of institutions. You cannot have long-term economic growth unless you have a state, and unless that state can do things that states are supposed to do, like provide public services and public goods, maintain a basic rule of law, domestic order, defense from enemies, and the like. And I think if you look around the world today, you'll see that those parts that have successfully developed had relatively strong states in their pre-modern periods, and it was only a matter of getting the policies right that then allowed them to take off. So the state, in many respects, in China was more ancient than it was in Europe. You go all the way back, 3 and 4 centuries, and you still had things that looked like centralized administrative apparatuses with bureaucrats and taxation and cadastral surveys and all those sorts of things that states undertake. And so it actually wasn't that big a leap for a relatively strong state like China to figure out that communism was a kind of stupid economic policy, replace it with one that listened to market signals, and then they take off like gangbusters. But in many parts of the world, including where I'm going, Papua New Guinea, and including many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there was not a prior tradition of stateness. There were in certain parts of Africa, but in many other parts of the developing world, you had institutions that were at a lower level of development than anything that we would call a state. And in many other parts of the world, what institutions you had were severely disrupted by colonialism. And I think the case of this was clearly the worst in Africa, where you had a whole variety of traditional institutions at the time of European colonization, and colonization came very late there in the 1870s and 1880s. And the Europeans basically, by the time they got to Africa, didn't want to give them real institutions because they wanted, they were kind of exhausted. They were looking at each other warily in the decades prior to the Great War, and they wanted to do colonialism on the cheap. So instead of what the British did in India, which was spending a 200-year period building Indian institutions, they tried to empower local elites. They did various variations on local rule that managed to undermine traditional institutions without transmitting anything like modern state institutions. And I think that this is one of the big problems in global development right now. You cannot solve the poverty problem and get people on this escalator that'll get you up to this $6,000 level without being able to solve this prior question of having a state and having a political order that can provide these sorts of basic services. I would go further than that and say that there is actually an important degree to which the current international system actually promotes state weakness in a whole variety of ways. Sometimes we kill countries by kindness. About 8 to 12% of the GDP of every sub-Saharan African country actually comes from the international donor community. So it's not lack of generosity, I think, that's the problem. But what happens is that when you transfer money on those levels, you also infantilize countries because they actually don't need to create their own institutions. They can rely on NGOs and external donors to do this. In a lot of cases, we freeze conflicts. Europe went through, in its historical evolution to its current 20th century stage, it went through actually 3 separate stages of evolution. There's a stage of state formation, which was a bloody period. European rulers fought each other to create territorially coherent spaces, political spaces. A lot of that required basically ethnic cleansing to make sure that they were relatively homogeneous. A process that really continued up through the late 20th century. Excuse me. Second stage was the implementation of a liberal rule of law that restrained the sovereign. And then finally, and only at the end, you had democratization. And that process that took 500 years in the case of a country like France, we are expecting developing countries to replicate within a generation. Excuse me. And so for that reason, the problem of poverty remains. Well, I've been fighting a cold for the last week, and my voice may be giving out. Fortunately, we're at the 4th point now. The last point is technology. As I said, the historical process is driven by the unfolding of modern science and technology. Up till now, excuse me, technology has been able to solve the problems that it set for itself, particularly the problem of economic productivity. There's no particular reason to think that this will continue forever. And we have certain technological developments that could obviously end modernization tomorrow. The one that we've been particularly worried about is the question of global warming. But there are others as well. There's been a democratization of military technology, the whole problem of weapons of mass destruction, democratizes extremely powerful means of destruction that used to be only in the possession of nation states. Now individuals potentially can employ it. And there are other issues as well. The ability to shape human behavior in very subtle ways through biotechnology is another issue that I have written about in the future. And there's no guarantee that our political institutions will keep up with this pace of technological development. You just look at the collective action problems that are engendered by dealing with global warming, and you see some dimensions of that problem. And on this 4th point, I give you no particular assurance. I cannot predict whether the growth of the institutions at an international level will meet these requirements or not. And if they don't, I think that the technology itself that has been the source of this broader story that I've been telling you about modernization may bring all of that to an end. Now, I just want to end by saying the following. I have been accused of being a kind of Marxist, and of course, the end of history was a Marxist concept, and as I said, I was just getting off one station early. But I think that I am quite different from most Marxists in the sense that I do not believe that there are iron laws of history. I do not believe that any of the forces that I have described that would tend to create a long-term process of modernization or a universal history, as I've described it, lock societies in. Agency, individual human agency, is extremely important. If particular battles had not been won, if particular politicians had not gotten elected or had not taken power in a coup d'etat, the entire subsequent history of those societies could be written very differently. I believe, as does Bob Wright, that in the end there are certain equilibrating mechanisms in human societies, so that if an invention is invented in one society and then squelched as the rifle was in early Tokugawa Japan, it eventually will get out because it confers an advantage, and there will be a process of defensive competition as societies interact with each other. That means that none of these inventions can ever be suppressed for terribly long, but it doesn't mean that in the meantime you can't have tremendous variation simply based on the kinds of political choices that we as citizens or we as politicians or we as government officials make. So the fact that I still believe that there's such a thing as history does not relieve any of us from our responsibilities as individuals to be political participants, because we, in very important ways, can continue to shape our political futures. I'm not going to take any more risks with my voice completely going out, so maybe I'll just stop there and we can just take questions. But thank you very much for your attention.
Take a long drink and a long breath there. Thank you, Frank. From Dan, there's a question in red ink. Raise your hand if you're Dan with a red ink. Do you believe in Jared Diamond's collapse scenario could happen on a global scale? And I would ask, while we're talking about Diamond, he got his start on the guns, germs, and steel thesis in Papua New Guinea.
That's right.
Where they were saying, how come I'm carrying your stuff?
Well, yeah, I've got a lot to say about that. First of all, as I just said, I think that you could have a civilizational collapse for very straightforward reasons. I mean, if some of the more dire predictions about global warming are true, it's probably too late to do anything about it, and we could cook ourselves, and so there are various ways that could happen. I think, though, that his so it's a good warning on a general level. I do think, however, that there's probably more robustness built into human societies than collapse suggests. I reviewed that book, actually, and I was struck by the fact that half of his cases took place in these extraordinarily marginal environmental niches where human beings were probably never destined to live in any event. And so the fact that they all died out of these little islands in the South Pacific that really couldn't sustain vegetable life of any sort is probably not a big accident. There's a much more important issue with regard to development that he raises in Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is that he's basically a materialist determinist in a sense. I mean, that was the big thrust of that book, that most people looking in development would say, well, it's institutions, it's culture, it's politics and so forth. And he said, no, that's not right. It's the material endowments, the disease burdens, the mineral resources, other sorts of things that countries were given not as a result of their own choice, but by nature. And this is actually, among development economists, led to a big argument, because Jeff Sachs, among others, has taken this up and argued that the real reasons for the lack of development in places like Africa is essentially disease burdens, malaria, and things that are really beyond the control of the particular societies, and that institutions are simply a function of getting richer. And there's another school, which I actually adhere to, that says it's the other way around, that you can create modern societies in very inauspicious places. Singapore is in the tropics. If you have the right kinds of institutions. And without boring you with that whole argument, I think that, in a way, the collapse book began to recognize the importance of some of these non-material factors in development to a much greater extent than the first one did, which I think was that was an important change.
I get the sense you take global warming more seriously than you used to.
I never didn't take it seriously. It seems to me that even if you think that it's not, the science isn't there, it's still a matter of risk, and given the consequences of betting wrong on this, it probably pays to hedge, so I don't know what the problem is.
So you've been looking at Islam because it's one of the 4 questions raised about your thesis. Do you think that Islam can have basically what amounts to the equivalent of the Protestant Reformation in a period of time that will be part of your 20-year time frame?
Well, not the 20-year time frame, I would suspect. There's a very interesting parallel between radical Islamism and the Protestant Reformation. There's a French Islamicist, Olivier Roy, who wrote a book about 3 years ago called Globalized Islam that made this very interesting case that he said, that a lot of people have complained that there's no Muslim Luther to set about a more liberal form of Islam. And Roy argued that maybe the Muslim Luther is living among us and his name is Osama bin Laden. And the reason for that is actually quite evident once you think about it. The Protestant Reformation was not a liberal revolution. John Calvin ran a very authoritarian, very intolerant city in Geneva, and the Protestant princes in Central Europe were not fighting for pluralism. They were fighting to impose their particular brand of Christianity on everybody else. But it did create the grounds for modern individualism because Protestantism separated belief from actual practice and made it something internal. And Law's argument is that, in a way, that's what's happening in the Muslim diaspora. If you're a Muslim in Britain, surrounding society does not endorse your religiosity, and it has to become something internal. And so maybe that plus another 100 years of conflict in the Muslim world will lead to similar conclusions as happened at the end of the early modern period in Europe. But that's really long-term thinking.
Robin has a question. Where's Robin? Right here. The other part of your book's title is "And the Last Man."
Right.
And you describe the end of history as being populated by these sort of sublimated, pallid men without chests, all lawyers and bureaucrats. Has your view changed? Does modernity have to be that way?
Well, the end of history, the fellow that wrote about this most cogently was Alexandre Kojève, who was a Russian-French philosopher that did this very influential seminar in Paris in the 1930s and 40s. And of course, his view, which I would agree with, was that the end of history is really represented not by America, but by the European Union. And then he went on to become a bureaucrat in the European Union. And I think actually the European Union today represents the end state of the end of history much more than the United States. I mean, Americans, we're actually quite militaristic. We love 4th of July parades, and we like our army, and we launch wars and do all sorts of things that last men really don't do, whereas Europeans actually believe that they're in this post-national period where the big problem is sovereignty and national selfishness, and that they're creating this, this home for the last man called the European Constitution, where you get beyond all of that stuff.
San Francisco, you may know, is planning to join the European Union. Schwarzenegger is making the connection. You spoke about France taking 500 years to do something, and Singapore and Dubai have been attempting the same thing in much shorter time. Eric has the question, when that happens, do places like Singapore and Dubai have a long-term effect on neighboring regions, particularly with respect to groups resistant to modernization in those regions?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I think that sometimes they serve as positive examples. Taiwan, for example, I think was extremely important in changing the thinking of the Chinese communist leadership, because they saw Chinese society just across the Taiwan Straits that was growing like crazy because it had a market economy, and I think they drew some lessons for that. But on the other hand, modernization produces all of these complex effects. It's very socially disruptive, and so there are other places that could be destabilized by very rapid modernization.
What's interesting there is Taiwan kept much more of the traditional Chinese culture, herb shops and things like that, than mainland China did. And so another part that seemed to go across the straits was some of the traditional Chinese practices.
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, you had communism intervening in China, which went after Confucianism and the family and many aspects of traditional Chinese culture. So that may be part of the explanation.
Of course, a couple of political ones. I know you don't mind, because you had a whole ravening group of communists in New Hampshire or somewhere.
Yeah, that's right.
After you. Marxists, sorry, we don't have communists anymore, except in Cuba. This one's from John Renish. What do you think of the Project for a New American Century, which you endorsed back in 2000? And since then, it's been pretty thick in U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I find it very amusing, all these conspiracy theories built around the Project for the New American Century, because this was basically Bill Kristol in a fax machine. And every time, every time he thought something ought to be done, he'd send a fax around to all of his friends, including me, and say, well, would you be willing to sign this letter? And so on a couple of occasions, I signed the letter. And I don't think that as an organization, it represented anything more than that. Now, underlying that were all sorts of networks of people that had worked together in different administrations and, with common educational, Bill Kristol's actually, I inherited his apartment in Cambridge because we were classmates in graduate school, in the Harvard government department. So, so you have all these social ties that go back, but they're, that organization in and of itself, I don't think was important.
And since then, you started a magazine. You want to say a little bit about that?
Oh, free advertising. All right. I started a new magazine called The American Interest. My article, The End of History, had originally been published in a magazine called The National Interest, which went under new management about 3 years ago that I didn't like, and so I left that. And it seemed to me that, in the late 1940s, centrism and bipartisanship were really very popular. And then we entered this 30-year period where it was just not cool to be centrist, and everybody was pushing the envelope on both ends of the political spectrum, mostly on the right, but then, on the left in response to that. And you could always get airtime for yourself by trumping and saying something more outrageous than the last person. I mean, Ann Coulter is now, the absolute queen bee of all of this stuff. But I think that, that period is over now, because I think that if you don't get back to some kind of reasonable discussion that doesn't begin from your political label, but begins with actually the problem that you have to solve, then you're not going to get anywhere as a democracy. So the American Interest was founded with that in mind. The other thing about it is that it relates to this business about America and the world, because when we started the magazine, a lot of people would say, I just don't understand what the United States is right now. And that wasn't just non-Americans saying that. I mean, I think a lot of Americans can't figure out exactly what's going on in the country. And so the magazine was designed both to promote that kind of reasonable political discussion, but also to try to explain the United States to everybody else, and to try to reconnect the U.S. with the rest of the world.
Okay, one more partisan question. This one from Diane Pfeiffer. 2 words, Scooter Libby. Explanation, as I understand, you were an advisory committee member or something in support of him, and an old friend.
Well, I'll come clean. I worked for Paul Wolfowitz on 2 occasions in the Arms Control Agency in the mid-1970s, and then where I met Scooter was when I worked for him on the policy planning staff in the early 1980s in the White House. And so I've been a friend of Scooter's for the last, well, you count the years since 1981. And then he went on to do the things that he did, and then he got into trouble, and he called me up and said, would you be on my, whatever it is, committee, legal defense committee? And I said, of course, you're an old friend of mine, and it's quite independent of my, at this point I had already written my last book, America at the Crossroads, in which I explained why I was bailing out of this whole neocon way of looking at the world. But that doesn't mean that you're not a friend of who you're a friend of. So that's the only explanation.
Say a little bit about your book, America at the Crossroads, is in the outside the theater, and I recommend it. Just say a little bit about what your critique of the neocons came to be, and maybe where it is this very minute.
Yeah. Well, that'll trigger a whole new tape here. But I'll give you the 3-minute version of it.
Sure. We got other stuff here.
No, I mean, part of the reason I wrote that book was that I did not think that, neoconservatism goes all the way back to City College in the late 1930s, and all of these very radical groups, some of them Trotskyite and some of them Stalinist, that inhabited the alcoves of the cafeteria there. And they all, there were people like Irving Howe, Irving Kristol, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Nathan Glazer, Daniel Bell, Seymour Martin Lipset, people that became absolute giants as academics and as public intellectuals in the next generation. And I thought that it was too bad that a movement with this kind of pedigree was being associated with advocacy of the Iraq War, because there were other principles that they had talked about that I think would not have necessarily led to that, among which were a very great cautiousness about social engineering. The Irving Kristol magazine, The Public Interest, was all about the potentially negative effects of social engineering when it came to American domestic social policy, and it just struck me that a group of people with that kind of pedigree would then want to engage in one of the biggest social engineering projects you could imagine in the Middle East.
Biotechnology, sometimes you sound a little bit like Bill Joy. The democratization of weapons of mass destruction, biotechnology that may be coming in to alter human nature itself and moving at a speed faster than you think the political process can keep up. Want to see a little more about that?
Yeah, I don't foresee inevitable doom here, because in the past our institutions really have adjusted to take account of these new technologies. It's always, Deborah Spar wrote this book called Ruling the Waves a few years ago, where she actually looked at radio and television and a whole bunch of technological innovations. And, first few years say, oh, it's completely unregulable, and then eventually they figure out how to regulate it, and then it comes under, greater control. And so I expect that process to continue, but I think that there are going to be some, difficult dimensions of this, particularly in biotechnology, because so many of the things that trouble me about it are also the things that are great, that make it good. The fact that it's therapeutic means that it's an undoubtedly good thing to promote, but the same drug that can be used for therapeutic purposes can be used for enhancement purposes in ways that, you might find, or one might find ethically questionable. And so I think as a problem of political control, it's a tough one. But I'm not necessarily a pessimist about this. Even in the case of nuclear weapons, I think that we created this miracle. I mean, the non-proliferation regime. If you look at the writing on the bomb in the period right after 1945, people were predicting that there would be nuclear wars and 50, 60 nuclear states within a generation. And that simply didn't come to pass.
We got close a couple times.
We got close, but yep.
There's been 3 talks in this series talking about the singularity, the idea of accelerating technology, not only getting ahead of the political process, but basically getting ahead of history and everything else, so that one can't know what's coming next. Ray Kurzweil gave the full story on that. Bruce Sterling mocked it, and Werner Vinci came here and gave 3 scenarios of how he thought it might not happen, but he still thought it probably would happen. Now, Roger Smith, who's here, raised the question, Bruce Sterling sees a threat that human cognition will become industrialized by hyper-acceleration of technology, leading to their version of the end of history, which is the singularity.
I don't have an opinion about that. I mean...
Wow! This is the end of history. This is your stuff.
Yeah, I know that.
You know, it's the Christian rapture, only, modernized.
Right. I am not convinced that the story of ever-accelerating technological change, at least as it plays out in society, is necessarily one that I accept. This is one comparison that I have asked my students to think a lot about. If you compare the nature of American society between the years 1850 and 1900, and between the years 1950 and 2000, which of those produced greater changes in the way that Americans lived? And I think without question it was that earlier period. In 1850, majority of Americans lived on farms in isolated places without good national communication. By the year 1900, they were living in cities in industrialized circumstances, mass education, all sorts of really important social changes brought about by essentially industrialization. If you look at between 1950 and 2000, of course there's the internet and information technology, which has had a big impact, but we're still living in a carbon-based set of energy technologies. Many other things we have more of, but in many respects the rise of female empowerment, diversity, a lot of other big social changes. But in many respects, I'm not sure that those collectively were as great as the ones experienced a century before. And so I guess...
So essentially, we could have a singularity and barely notice.
Or it could be that the social response to this acceleration is equilibrating mechanisms that exist on a whole variety of different levels that tend to push back against whatever change is taking place. But
let me raise a cell phone question in this context. So when you go to Japan, you'll see Japanese schoolgirls pushing the edge of the possibilities, what you can do with a cell phone. Here comes the iPhone, it's going to push another set of possibilities. And when you go to Papua New Guinea, probably pretty far in the bush, you're going to see folks with cell phones. And the numbers we're hearing now is that about 3 billion people have cell phone connectivity. In the developing world, you can get a cell phone or access to a cell phone for $10. Yeah. And everybody's using it. And it's a thing which cuts right through all of this poverty stuff, all of this failed state stuff, a whole lot of the things which you've laid out as kind of the defining forces here. One question I guess I would put to you now, and maybe it would be fun to do it again after your trip, where do you think cell phone plays into your story of the coming of liberal democracy?
The cell phone and other information technologies of the past generation have broadly been good for liberal democracy because I think, broadly speaking, they tend to diffuse power rather than to concentrate. I think the steel and iron and coal age was probably bad for democracy because economies of scale tended to centralize power and so forth. So on that kind of very abstract level, I think that's the case. But as I understand the idea of a singularity, you have one set of technological developments that then produce results that are really not linear and very unanticipated and so forth. And I would be astonished if the cell phone revolution created a real state in Papua New Guinea in 25 years or solved the poverty problem in Africa. There are certain dimensions of those problems that I think that or maybe technology we don't know about could address. But my understanding of the sources of development is that it is so complex and it is so much based on an interlocking of a lot of different factors that there are very few times when you just, turn one knob and then, the whole switchboard lights up.
Yeah, that's fair. We should honor the
we'll
bearing in your voice. One more question. This one's from Kevin Kelly. After universal values are reached for most of the world, what's next?
Well, there's actually a part of this that I think is here and now, which is really, in a way, the problem of the last man, that even in modern liberal democracies, we have a very thin moral community. That's, we're pluralistic and tolerant. We do not impose very strong opinions about good and evil on people that live in our societies. And for the most part, this is not adequate for a lot of people, that they don't want to just be recognized as free and equal human beings, equal to every other human being on the earth. They want to be Quebecois, or they want to be, women or members of indigenous community, or Ukrainian, or some other source of communal identity that is not universal, but that does have stronger values or is bound by, something tighter than just citizens in a impersonal democracy. And this is why identity politics has, I think, become so important in all developed societies. And there's some versions of identity politics that then actually corrode the basis of liberal democracy itself. They're facing this problem in Europe already. If a Muslim family wants to force their daughter to marry somebody back in Morocco and she doesn't want to do it, right? What does the state do about that in terms of, do you enforce her rights as a free citizen, or do you defer to the community's interest? And there's just a whole series of problems that we are living with now because of this tension between group rights and individual rights. And
do you see a trend?
Well, obviously, for a long period from the 60s up until the past decade, the trend was towards multiculturalism and towards the acceptance of group identities increasingly. I think what's interesting in Europe right now is that there's been an absolute revolt against this because of the violence that you've seen in Holland and Britain and elsewhere. And in fact, the Dutch are kind of at the extreme of this because they not only recognize groups, I mean, Protestants and Catholics and socialists are all organized with their own political parties, schools, trade unions, newspapers. And when the Muslims showed up, they just said, okay, you can have your own pillar, which is, it's kind of the ultimate version of this identity politics. But the problem was that it turned out that people in the Muslim pillar were not actually feeling like they were part of Dutch society. And so there's been this big backlash against that and towards the feeling that you have to have a broader, more inclusive national identity. And so we'll see where we go with this because...
Well, I'll pursue this for a minute because it does really challenge your thesis in a sense. You were saying the European Union is the model.
Yeah.
But the European Union is having more of an identity politics issue than the militaristic, jingoistic U.S.
This is the another way in which I could be falsified is if you get backlash movements, for example, against immigration in Europe that undermine the liberal basis of European society, which I think is conceivable. I wouldn't bet on it, but it's conceivable. Yeah, I mean, my thesis would be wrong.
The book you'll write then as well, History is Back On?
Well, this is really... No, I mean, I would say that Huntington then would be right. I mean, this is a retreat. This is the basic difference between us. That he believes that these communal identities are primary and that you're never going to get beyond them, and that liberal institutions and globalization, whatever forces for integration they represent, are not strong enough to melt this kind of communal glue. And I believe that the integrating forces are strong enough, that the defeat of them by these primordial attachments is not given. And that's the essence of the dispute between us.
That's clear. Do you think we'll know by 2050 which way it's going?
I would hope a lot sooner than that, because I think a lot of this stuff is going to hit a crisis, much sooner than 2050.
Say just a little more. European goes in crisis because of no more immigrants?
Yeah. You're already seeing a lot of that, and backlash politics. You're seeing that in a different form in this country as well. And so I do think this is actually going to play out in the next decade, and we don't have to wait till 2050 to see.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.